Hello again, Netrunner fans. Willingdon here. I'm back for part 4 of my Corset retrospective, in which I'm looking at the Corset from the perspective of 2015 and the things that we know about the game having it been played so many times. If you haven't seen the other 3 videos in this series, I'd recommend checking them out, especially the Anarch one. There's some concepts that I talk about in those videos that I'm not going to fully repeat or explain in this video as they come up, so it's probably going to be better if you've already seen those and know what I'm talking about. In this video, we're going to be looking at the Jinteki cards that were in the core set, and we're going to start off by talking about the ID that was in the box. That's Jinteki Personal Evolution, commonly known as PE. If you've seen a lot of my videos, you probably know that I have a soft spot for PE, and when the core set came out, I was immediately drawn to Jinteki and this strategy right off the bat. PE has always been at the edge of tournament viability for corporation play. There was a period, especially after Honor and Profit, where there was a lot of interest in PE, a lot of people trying to do damage-based Jinteki decks, and PE is just such a natural choice for a flatline-oriented Jinteki deck. One of the big appeals of PE, both for the tournament player and the casual player, is that it has such a very different play style, both as the runner and the corporation. PE also gets to take special advantage in the bluffing area of the game, which I think a lot of the tournament viable decks don't really use extensively. They don't really capitalize on the fact that the corp is playing with lots of face down stuff, and there can be really nasty surprises for the runner. PE is very different. It definitely capitalizes on the surprise factor. Face down cards and just what's been known as the shell game is a huge part of the PE playstyle, and I think this appeals to a lot of players because it's really at the heart of the interaction between the runner and the corp. You get to play a very psychological game, you get to read your opponent, and there's a lot of bluffing and counter bluffing. PE was such a fantastic design. I really like this as the starting ID for Jinteki. It really sets the precedent of what the faction is going to be capable of. But as I'm going to talk about in these videos, there are a number of problems with the Jinteki card pool that I think persist to this day that caused PE to not really be as strong as some of those more glacier and less damage-oriented versions of Jinteki. The core problem with Jinteki, especially with PE, was the lack of economy options, and that's something we're going to talk about throughout this video. In general, PE, and just Jinteki overall, has had too few economy options, and the ones that it's had have been interesting and powerful, but they've been good in specific decks. I think Sundew is a really good example. It's hard to play Sundew in a PE deck because they can just run and trash it, and you don't really have a lot of good ways to defend it since you can't put your nastiest traps in the same server as it. So in general, Sundew has really only seen play in RP because of its obvious synergy with the RP ID. The same is true to a lesser extent with Jinteki's other really powerful economy options, Celebrity Gift. You don't necessarily want to play Celebrity Gift in a PE deck because you're going to show them all of the traps or, in some cases, agendas that you have, and your runner opponent can make a lot more informed decisions if you've played a Celebrity Gift. I would have really liked to see an economy option that would have been really strong in this bluff-oriented, damage-oriented style. I would have really liked to see a card like that in the core set. To this day, I'm not sure that we really have that card. The closest thing I can think of is Mushin Notion, which definitely pumped up the power of PE substantially, but it's hard to say that that's exactly an economy card. The next card is the agenda that's in the box, and that's Nisei Mark II. This is essentially a direct reprint from original Netrunner, and this card has worked out really well. Nisei Mark II is a big reason that the Glacier styles have been better than the flatline-oriented styles. I would argue that Nisei Mark II has the strongest defensive effect of basically any agenda in Netrunner. The only defensive effects that are really competing with it are the ones that are tied to specific agendas that make those agendas more difficult to steal, so stuff like NAPD Contract or Future Perfect. Nisei Mark II is one of the few 4-for-2s in Netrunner that has an effect that's strong enough to justify playing a 4-for-2. In general, 4-for-2s and 5-for-3s are really weak because they're so hard to score compared to 3-for-2s. You have to signal to the runner that it is an agenda by advancing it ahead of time, and then you have to put it in some server that they can't just immediately access and score your agenda. And the biggest complaint that I have about 4-for-2s and 5-for-3s is that they don't have effects that are on the level of this card. If all of the 4-for-2s would have been as powerful as Nisei Mark II, I think there'd be a lot more incentive to use them in a Glacier style deck. We'd be a lot more concerned with getting our agenda scored so that we could have some huge impact on the game. And that's a really good design philosophy for agendas. I really like the idea that agendas have powerful effects tied to them. I think it's thematically appropriate. It justifies the corp trying so hard to get them scored and things like that. So this was a great precedent setter for 4-for-2s. This really marked a line in the sand of what 4-for-2s were capable of. I just love this design. This was kind of a sleeper though. There wasn't really a way to use this card earlier in Netrunner. Jinteki had such a flimsy defense and such a flimsy economy that there wasn't really a viable way to try to do a Glacier style, especially with PE as your ID. Now, RP was printed pretty quickly after the Corset, but it lacked a lot of the economy tools that it needs, like the modern day version has, to power its robust economy. And one of the big problems with the Corset we're going to be talking about in this video is that Jinteki just didn't get any economy options and really just needed more defensive stuff and economy options to be able to compete with the other corp factions. Next up is Project Junebug. This is a card that has flatlined tons of new players and is just kind of an iconic card for the game, but I think it's just never seen that much play because of a few critical problems with it. I'd like to first talk about a few of the things that this card got right. The biggest one and the most important one is that it has a huge payoff. In order for advanceable cards to be worth including or playing, they really need to have some massive impact. I would say 2 damage per counter is considered massive. The other thing that I really like about this design is the fact that it costs a credit to activate. I really like the concept of the runner being able to run this sort of thing with impunity if they can somehow get the corp down to no credits, like through Vamp or Siphon or something like that. That seems very fair to me. It seems like a good way to play around and give the runner a way to play around this sort of effect and be able to check a server that would be too deadly to run into otherwise. I think this could have just been a little more powerful. I think this could have just been a lot more generally playable. The way I would like to see that done is a combination of this card and Shock, so that it has the ability to still be advanced and things like that, but it also does a damage if they access it out of a central. That would have made this card a lot more generally playable, and I think it would have made Shock a little bit better as well, because you could have done something with Shock once you drew it and it was kind of a dead card in your hand. This hypothetical design that I'm coming up with here is actually pretty similar to the card from original Netrunner that Junebug was based on, and I don't really know why Junebug was made a lot weaker in the sense that it doesn't have that shock effect tied to it. Now, there's certainly aspects of Junebug that are a little better than the original design, and I don't think that Junebug is a bad design. I don't think it's a bad card. I just think it's so at the heart of the way that Jinteki plays, the whole install advance bluff type of thing, the Mushin Notion shell game type of thing. I feel like those effects should have been even better and should have been even more extensively played so that we more often get into that shell game scenario. I think we can agree that that's an awesome part of Netrunner. It's something that we all like a lot of, and while Junebug does that pretty well, does that really well actually, I think it could have just been a better overall card to make it a lot easier to play in your decks. Next up is everyone's favorite ambush trap, that's Snare. Is there any card that captures the feeling and flavor of Jinteki quite like Snare? I think basically everyone loves this card to some degree. We've all ran into this card far more than we'd like to admit, and this is just such an iconic trap. This is what most people think of when they think of Jinteki traps. This is a direct reprint from the original game, and I can definitely appreciate that they retained the exclamation mark in the title. I think we can agree that Snare is probably a better name than Trap, but that exclamation mark, that really helps capture the way people feel about this card. Pretty much everything is right about this card, and I think this is just a fantastic design that fits the game really well, helps define Jinteki maybe more than any other card, and this just works really well in all of the decks that it's been played in. I really like that it's expensive to activate, so that you can pretty easily know when they're unable to do it as the runner. You know, if they don't have 4 credits, they're not going to be able to snare you. It also has a big payoff with both the net damage and the tag. The tag certainly makes the card a lot more versatile. You can see it included in meat damage flatline decks that are trying to play cards that only work if they're tagged, like Scorched Earth. All around, this card has worked out really, really well. I think everything about this design is perfect, and this is just exactly what you would want to show to a new player to help them understand what Jinteki's all about. Next up is the card that was one of the one-ofs that you get in the core set. That's Saibatsu Loyalty. I really like the art and flavor and just feeling of this card. I think it really speaks to what Jinteki's all about. It definitely fits them both mechanically and thematically. I really like the idea that these assets, or the owners of these assets, won't turn themselves over, won't reveal themselves because they're so loyal to this evil corporation. That's pretty cool. Now, this card has always been a pretty big stinker though, mainly because of problems with expose effects. There's kind of 2 core problems with playing this card. First is that expose effects on the whole just aren't that strong. So really, the average deck is maybe playing like 1 or 2 of them, even in a PE-rich environment, which there's been very few of those in the history of Netrunner. The bigger problem is that there aren't very many good expose effects that you can use repeatedly. It's pretty much just silhouette in terms of expose effects you can use all the time and be competitive. And this card really shines against those repetitive effects, the ability to expose things over and over, because it lets you protect a variety of cards for just a credit each. It's possible that this card will see a little more play in the future. It seems to me like the designers have realized that expose effects just aren't that strong, and that they're starting to print stronger expose effects, especially Drive-By is just way better than basically every other expose effect they've printed. So maybe in the future, this card could be a little more realistic if there's more powerful effects that do things that aren't just expose cards. I think the big nail in this card's coffin was the printing of Psychic Field. Psychic Field just did the anti-expose thing quite a bit better than this, because Psychic Field actually had a use outside of that context. Psychic Field still did something if they just ran into it and weren't even playing expose effects. I would have liked to see this card also have some more general use. It would have been nice if this had a similar ability to Psychic Field, where if it was exposed or accessed while it's installed, it dealt net damage. That would have just made this card a lot more flexible. It would have made it more of a general use card. You could have just included it for the purposes of playing down more assets, and then if they ran it, it would be more than just some card they're not going to trash. It would have also given PE decks both a nice tool to prevent the exposing of cards, and another minor source of net damage, I think they could really use both of those things in modern versions. This card is a reprint, but they buffed it slightly. The original version, you could just pay a credit. You weren't able to trash it to prevent the exposing. That's such a minor buff. I really wish they would have just made this card even stronger, because as it is, it's a little bad, and I really like the theme and flavor of this. I wish it would have just been more widely played. Next up is the classic PE finisher, and that is Knull EMP. I was kind of surprised to find out that this wasn't a reprint or a reworking of a card from original Netrunner. This is actually a totally unique design, and it fits so well with what the Jinteki style is trying to do. I'm really happy with this card. Kind of like the Scorched Earth decks, most PE decks can pile a couple of these into hand and wait until you do something where you're going to get yourself killed. A lot of times this involves running R&D or running into a server that you didn't expect there to be a trap. You get hit for a bunch of damage and you can't recover by drawing enough cards to survive next turn. There's a lot of good things going on with this design. I really like the 2 credit cost. That makes it really expensive. It's pretty easy to play around as the runner. As long as you know that they're not going to have a bunch of credits on their turn, they're not going to be able to play multiple copies of this. I also really like the requirement of they had to make a run, not necessarily a successful one. It makes it easier to play, but it also makes the runner have a way that they can totally avoid it if they're worried. It's limitations like this play only if they made a run that encourage interaction and tension between the players. I really like that. Knull EMP has always been a big threat from the PE perspective. It's been the finisher of a huge number of decks, and I think overall this card has done exactly what it was supposed to do. Next up is a card that I only played in the year 2013, and that's Precognition. This card is a huge trap for new players. It has a somewhat useful effect, but there's just a lot better ways to go about doing this, especially Jackson Howard and nowadays Daily Business Show. This is just not good enough, and I'm not sure it was really even good enough in 2013. Pretty much the only way that this card is actually seen play is in combination with things that do something off the top of R&D, like Accelerated Diagnostics or Mutate. Both of those effects are pretty weak overall, so having to play some other weak card to enable them has just been too janky and really has been relegated to more casual decks. This card was a big missed opportunity for Jinteki to get a deck manipulation effect that was high influence and could help you find all of those economy options, put agendas away so they weren't easy to get access to off of R&D and things like that. This just needed to be way better. I think it could have added a card to HQ and then let you rearrange them on the top or bottom of R&D. That would have let you put agendas that you didn't want down to the bottom and you'd know where they were at. That would make it a lot easier to play like Future Perfect and stuff like that in your PE deck. This is basically a direct reprint from the original game. They just removed a subtype from it. But I think the fact that this was in a faction, especially a faction that had really weak overall economy and defense, really just made this card not see a lot of play. I think that if this was a neutral card like the original game, it might have seen a little more play, but overall, I think this was a big missed opportunity to give Jinteki a unique effect that fit the flavor and theme of their faction really well, the whole psychic aspect. I think this really was a big missed opportunity to give Jinteki a powerful deck manipulation effect that was unique to their faction and difficult to play outside of their faction. Next up, we're talking about the Gentek Ice that was in the box, and I want to give some brief remarks about those before we talk about them in particular. I think overall, the ideas of these ice were really good and really helped to set Jinteki apart from the other factions, but the particular implementations of almost all of these was pretty bad. None of these ice have really seen that much play, and it would have been nice to get some more general ice, some ice that was just widely more powerful, and most of the ice that we play extensively in our faction, in our Jinteki decks today, are ice that were printed much later. Most of the Corset ice is too bad to really see a lot of play. The lack of flexible ice options was probably the biggest problem with Jinteki outside of the economy. So I think that while the Corset established a lot of ideas of Jinteki Ice well, the fact that most of these implementations were far too weak definitely held back the faction until we saw something like Honor and Profit. I want to also talk about one thing from the original game. A lot of the ice from which these Jinteki Ice were derived had this subroutine that I'm going to call the stun subroutine. And we've only seen this subroutine on the card Inazuma, but there were a whole bunch of ice from the original game that both dealt net damage and had this stun effect where you couldn't break the next piece of ice you encounter. I'm not sure why it was discarded, why this stun subroutine was relegated to just one piece of ice rather than kind of being more extensive among Jinteki Ice. I think a lot of these ice that we're about to look at would have been stronger if they had this stun subroutine as an option, and I'm really just not sure why some of these ice were pretty substantially nerfed by removing that subroutine. The first piece of ice we're going to look at is Cell Portal. This card is frankly a joke among me and a few of the people I play Netrunner with. Overall, this is just an atrocious piece of ice. I don't know why this needed to be in the Corset, first of all, and while it has a lot of interesting ideas, I like the concept of the ice. This is far more interesting as a thought experiment than it is actually a card you play in a game. It's just too clumsy to use, it's too expensive to use, and it's just not really a card that you could realistically play. You're playing like 20 ice in your deck, and this has to be one of them. You can't really cut a good piece of ice to play this. I would have rather seen this have another subroutine just to be stronger, especially like the stun subroutine. Would have been really cool if it was stun plus they can't jack out. So if you put like some nasty net damage ice in front of your Cell Portal, you could throw them into it and then they would have to take the damage. That seems to be what this ice is trying to do, but since they can just jack out, since this is so expensive, this has been such a throwaway card, unfortunately. One thing I do like about this card is that it's an insanely high-strength code gate. I think that's an idea that the designers are warming up to a bit more lately, printing these high-strength code gates that have specialized effects. That's just a good idea, and I think there should have been more high-strength code gates in the early expansions for the game. In general, the strength of ice has been a little too low, especially with code gates. There's just been so many of them that get run over by Yogg. The next piece of ice is Chum. This card worked out far better than any of the other ice in the Jinteki core set. The thing that I really like about Chum is that it interacts well with ice that the runner is not going to break, ice that the runner was just planning on letting fire. Stuff like Pop-Up Window especially is really cool. The original version of this card was basically the same, except it was a Sentry instead of a Code Gate. And I think it was a really smart move that the designers switched it to Code Gate. A lot of times, players that are playing against Jinteki will just get Mimic, or they'll just get their Sentry Breaker in play, because there's so many net damage and just nasty ice that are Sentries. It's nice that this one was not a Sentry as well, so if they have to break Chum, they have to do it with a Code Gate breaker. It gives you more things to play at the Code Gate slot, and that's definitely been a weakness for a lot of Jinteki Ice. I really like this design. I would have liked to see this see more play, but I don't necessarily think that's a huge problem with the design of the ice, but rather kind of more the context of the other ice that we play with this card. Next up is Data Mine. This is the card that introduced us to the concept of trap type ice, And I think to this day, Trap type Ice is an underexplored area of the card pool. I really wish there were just more playable Trap type Ice. I really like the dynamic that your standard powerful breakers aren't able to overcome Trap type Ice, and you have to have some sort of AI breaker, which are usually not as efficient to deal with this type of thing. Now, the problem with Data Mine is just that it's too weak overall. This needed to just be stronger. The 1 net damage really just isn't enough. I would have rather seen this be more persistent than increase its power level. Like, I definitely wouldn't want to see this be like, do 3 net damage, then trash it. That's pretty lame. I would have much rather seen something like, it does the damage and then it returns to your hand, and then there's like a caveat that it can be destroyed if they break it. This would have allowed you to play a sort of shell game with your ice, because if you included multiples of this and they ran into them, you'd be returning them to your hand, you'd be installing new face down ice. Instead of the data mine, you could put something way nastier there, and then when they run into what they assume is data mine, they get hit with the nasty thing. I think that if this had a more persistent ability, like instead of trashing it, return to hand, you'd just be able to use this more. It would just be a more interesting card. It would see a lot more play in the PE style decks. As it is, this just isn't good enough to really see play in anything. And the only use for this I've ever really seen is with something like Tori Hanzo to hit them for a brain damage. There's a lot of things that were right about this. 2 strength definitely is right. 0 res cost is definitely right. I really just like the concept of trap type ice overall, but man, this implementation was just too weak. Next up is Knull Katana. This is the first piece of Jinteki Ice that was all about lots of net damage. I think it's fair to say that the modern ice that do net damage are a lot stronger than this one was. That said, Knull Katana was pretty cool in the Corset, as this powerful defining net damage effect really killed a lot of people that weren't expecting it. When you're a new player, you run into this thing and you're like, whoa, where did that come from? This is exactly the type of card, though, that I was talking about with the removal of the stun subroutines. There were quite a few ice in the original game that had subroutines kind of like this, where they dealt the damage and then they were followed up by that stun subroutine. I'm not sure why Knull Katana couldn't have just had that stun subroutine. They could have just jacked out after this, which is a lot of times the outcome with Knull Katana anyway. So I don't necessarily think that would have been a massive buff, but it would have been a way to distinguish Knull Katana from some of the other net damage ice that we have nowadays that just do much more damage, just are generally more effective. This was a decent attempt at early net damage ice. I just think that the designers were a little too skittish about printing really powerful net damage ice, and over time they've gotten a lot smarter about what net damage ice can be capable of. The next piece of ice is Wall of Thorns. This ice had a lot of good ideas and is actually a direct reprint from the original game. But in the original game, there were a lot of smaller barriers that dealt smaller amounts of net damage and also ended the run. I almost would have rather seen one of the smaller implementations of these barriers, and to this day we don't really have any of those. I think a smaller end the run barrier that poked them for a small amount of net damage, that's really something Jinteki would like to have, and it would have been awesome to have it in the core set. Now, Wall of Thorns is generally the type of ice that just hasn't seen a lot of play. It's expensive, and Jinteki economy is pretty bad outside of maybe RP, since RP gets to play Sundew, and it's really hard to play that outside of RP. And when we look at the other ice that we have in faction nowadays that are in this price range, pretty much the only advantage that Wall of Thorn offers is the fact that it's a barrier. But if we're going to get this big, high-end 8-cost barrier in the core set, I think it needed to just be stronger. If we compare this to like Toll Booth or some of the other really expensive ice that were in the core set, This is just much, much, much weaker, and I think it's really never been supported by either the economy options for Jinteki or just the rest of the card pool. If we're going to have this 8 cost high-end barrier, they should have went all the way and made it a lot stronger. I think this would have been a great candidate for a when encountered ability. My idea is that it could have, when encountered, dealt 2 net damage, or they'd end the run, kind of like Data Raven with the tag, and then it still could have had the 2 subroutines. This would have justified the 8 cost a lot more. It would make it something that we would consider in like modern day RP or just in more glacier oriented decks, which is definitely the type of role that this ice was serving. So I feel like this ice is really representative of the sort of schizophrenia that the Corset Jinteki had. On one hand, a lot of the effects were really strong for the glacier style decks. On the other hand, most of the card pool was all about the like PE net damage style. So this type of ice kind of straddled that fence. It wasn't really good for either of the 2 decks, and I think it would have been better to commit it to one or the other. The last card is Akitaro Watanabe. This guy I love, and I've always been a big fan of, but really he's just never been good enough. I've had him work out pretty well in a few decks that are trying to build massive scoring remotes, and I think that it would have been okay for him to be even better in that context, because that's pretty much the only use of this guy I've ever managed to pull off, despite the fact that I've been a huge fanboy of him and I've included him in way more decks than I should have. The main problem with him is that you need to get him in position at the right time, which usually involves playing more than one copy of him. You need him to be in that big remote server when the runner is going to run it, and when you're going to be able to capitalize on the lowering the cost of rezzing the ice thing. I would have liked to see this guy also reduce the install cost of ice on that server, just to make it a little more permissible to stack up a bunch of ice all on one server. In general, the install cost has been a big problem with building massive remotes, and I feel like there could have been some more cards to help you circumvent that, especially in the Corset. That's going to do it for my Corset Jinteki retrospective. The Corset got a lot of things right about Jinteki, especially conveying the flavor and mechanics that Jinteki were going to be good at. As a new player, I was so excited about the net damage sort of style, and to this day, that's still one of the big ways that Jinteki can be played. So I think that the Corset had a lot of right ideas for Jinteki. It did a very good job of conveying what the faction was going to be capable of, but unfortunately a lot of the implementations of the cards kind of straddled lines and didn't go far enough. And I think in general, the designers have gotten a lot of things right about Jinteki later on, especially after Honor and Profit and with some of the data packs leading up to Honor and Profit. The net damage stuff has gotten way better. The damage effects just overall have gotten a lot more consistent and powerful and have had a lot more varied implementations. Like I mentioned briefly, the core problem is this tension between Glacier style Jinteki that's all about building big ice servers, stacking up several ice that interact and things like that, and powerful effects like Nisei Mark II. But then the rest of the card pool is all about net damage and poking them and trying to flatline them. It really seems to me like it would have been better to commit more heavily to one or the other. I think the net damage thing is more what most of us think about with Jinteki, so I think it could have been better if they would have focused more of the card pool on that, made some of those effects better in the ways that I've described in this video, and to this day I think the PE style is just a little weaker than was intended. Despite the fact that many really high quality designs exist to support that, especially Snare and the Jinteki PE ID. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for the next part of this series.